My name is Jesse Lavoie, and I'm running a PTSD awareness campaign with the help of Namaste Technologies. I'm here today with Michael Krawitz. How's it going today, Michael?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, you mind telling us a little about yourself, Michael?
Sure. I am a U.S. Air Force veteran, United States Air Force veteran. I served in the Air Force in the 1980s. It's peacetime, but what they call the Cold War, and became injured. Actually, I don't suffer. We've been talking about post-traumatic stress, but I don't actually suffer from post-traumatic stress myself. I actually became injured. I got an artificial hip and broke my leg in a few places. I lost my spleen. I messed up my pancreas, my intestines. I even got a little crack on my skull. I have eye condition. All this stuff kind of amounts to a mess. And cannabis helps on a couple of fronts. Mostly pain, I think, would be my main use. But I've actually, after I got out of the service, I was separated from the service with a disability, and they did a medical board on me and kind of severed my career path short and put me on a path through a couple of hospitals on my way home, and went through a litany of different treatments and stuff like that in the VA, and eventually found that cannabis was really helpful in my treatment. And not only was it helpful in my treatment, but as we talked about a little bit, I have a history with antiques and stuff like that. With my dad being an auctioneer, I grew up in the antique business, and it all revolves really around me discovering the word cannabis. Interestingly, but when I discovered the word cannabis, it kind of set me on a path to discover the history. If you look at marijuana, even like Google marijuana, and it'll lead you a different set of information than if you Google cannabis. It's fascinating. But cannabis led me to this history. And when I discovered in the history books that 100 years ago, no kidding, 100 years ago, doctors were trained about patients like me, patients that had internal injuries and, broken bones and lots of pain. And they said that for a patient like that, cannabis was really a frontline medicine, that you should try cannabis. It was helpful to use less opiates and use the cannabis in that case. And I was furious to find out that I had to find that out through trial and error, after this litany of very painful kind of treatments and stuff that really didn't give me much benefit, at the VA, only to find out that, 100 years ago, the VA would have been, able to treat me right off the bat with cannabis, and that information was obscured from the public view, by this campaign that was set to remove this information. And only now, are we really learning about it again. And I've become an advocate for other veterans to make sure that they don't have to suffer through the same thing, to make sure that they don't have to find out through trial and error. I've worked throughout the United States to educate other veterans, on these issues, and have taken on the role of executive director of Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. And in that role, I've actually even been able to negotiate VA medical marijuana policy so that the VA in the United States can handle the issues around medical cannabis, and has guidance for the veterans and the doctors in the system.
So, what are some latest things that your organization, Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, has been doing lately?
Well, I'd like for the organization to really just have to work inside the VA. That would be preferable, would be just to work on VA policy. But unfortunately, in the United States, with cannabis being a Schedule One drug, the federal government, it's like kryptonite. They're just absolutely not able to handle it. They're even afraid to recommend it. In the United States, you don't get a prescription for cannabis. You get a recommendation for cannabis, and it's a free speech thing between you and your doctor. It avoids the relationship with the DEA and the prescription pad, and that filling out of the form to help me participate in a state medical marijuana program. The doctors inside the VA are afraid they'll be arrested by the DEA if they did that. Now, doctors outside the VA don't really feel afraid to write those recommendations, but doctors inside the VA do, and they've never been given any guidance to the contrary. So that's what we're doing. We're actually working with Congress to give them guidance so that they can feel comfortable filling out these forms. It's a small thing, really, in a way, but in a way, it's not. helps to bring the vets and the VA together. It helps to save, the veteran having to leave the VA and duplicate a lot of services, spend a lot of out-of-pocket money that they do not have to get a recommendation downtown and all. So it really is quite useful, but it's also just one step for us in eventually, the VA being ready to handle cannabis in the pharmacy. And while the VA isn't able to handle cannabis, we're working at the state level. I don't think we would have, with the Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, I think we would have just stayed right at the federal level, worked with national veteran service organizations, Congress, the VA, etc. But for the fact that the medical marijuana laws are set up under the state laws, we've worked at the state level, mostly just to make sure that the laws that are in place have the qualifying conditions necessary for most veterans to participate. And there's a handful of things that you can think of that, like phantom limb pain or traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress. These are things that are pretty easily associated with veterans. And indeed, as a veteran, in that small population of veterans, the veterans are much more likely to be disabled than the general public, much more likely to, suffer some of these conditions.
You were doing some traveling earlier this week. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing?
Well, yeah, actually just came back from a little bit of a whirlwind tour. I was up in New York State where we were working on adding post-traumatic stress to qualifying condition there. We've been working in New York State for about a year or so, but also right at the same time, the bill that we were working on in Colorado to add post-traumatic stress to qualifying condition made it through all the legislative committees and was sent to the governor. So the governor of Colorado, as I speak to you, has our effort, sitting on their desk waiting for a signature. And that's really significant because Colorado, we've been fighting for like 7 years to add that. It's the whole time that Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access has been fighting to add these qualifying conditions, like 6, 7 years. We've been fighting in Colorado that whole time. So if we get this done this year in Colorado, we've gone from where we just had one state, New Mexico, that specifically listed post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition, and we've added over 20 state laws. And now we have just like a couple of states left that don't have post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition. So it's really actually been way beyond my wildest expectations that we would do that in like 6, 7 years. And New York State, I went up there, I spoke with senators, and I just got news today. It made it out of the final Senate committee, and it's heading to the full Senate floor. It makes it out of there. We'll get that on the governor's desk in New York. And it's really important. We undertook working on post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition under state laws for specific reasons. I think that's important to mention. Number one, we based it on a mountain of research. There's research that's being attempted right now by Dr. Sue Sisley and MAPS, a multidisciplinary association for psychedelic studies, and they're great. They're fantastic. We love them. But we have to realize that the special nature of that study is that it's an FDA NIDA study of smoked marijuana, that they're actually smoking marijuana. But we've had studies of the active ingredient and different synthetic copies of the active. In fact, one that I like to talk about is Sesamet. It's one of these synthetic copies of THC. It was actually a study done in Canada, a double-blind placebo-based study that found that Sesamet was effective for PTSD. And we actually have studies in the U.S. that use the NIDA cannabis, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, official FDA cannabis in the U.S., to test to see if a joint, a marijuana cigarette, was actually it was called the bong study, and it was to prove that the bong was a better device than the joint, to show that the bong, the filtered through this glass tube with water or ice in it could actually be better than the marijuana cigarette. And actually they didn't test the ice, but they tested the bong against the joint. The joint came out to be a better delivery system. The joint delivered the THC into the bloodstream more effectively than like anything else. I think it was the most effective out of the different mediums that they tried. And I don't think that they tried a vaporizer. I think vaporizer, we'll get into that later. But the thing is that we know, that THC is in the cannabis. We know that THC works for post-traumatic stress. Why can't we make that stellar jump to say, oh, THC in the cannabis plant itself taken might actually help for post-traumatic stress? I think it's ridiculous, the NIDA position. So I think it's important to make that clear. And then I think it's also important to tell you that we started working on this to try to disconnect the notion of post-traumatic stress being a psychiatric disorder, that somehow this was a typical psychiatric, and it's not. And we wanted to disconnect ourselves from the psychiatric community as well. And I think that they've acted irresponsibly. I think that the psychiatric community, in opposing us, they've been, like in Colorado, they've been our chief opposition. And I think it's appalling, their behavior. They're not paying attention to science. They're just coming in and they're saying, cannabis is a drug of abuse. Why would you give a drug that's a drug of abuse to people that potentially are susceptible to substance abuse? It's ridiculous that they would take that position without looking at any of our evidence, without looking at any of we're willing to look at their information and understand their position on abuse, and we're not fighting with that, but they won't take into consideration anything we're saying about the science and the medicine. And it's very unfortunate. They're just taking kind of this hard government line. And I wanted personally, in our efforts and our Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access group that looked at this, decided that we were willing to take on the American Psychiatric Association, and we have, and we're proud of that at this point, because we've had a very good record of cannabis in these many states. And post-traumatic stress is not a typical psychiatric disorder. It's actually what we say it's a physical injury with a may have been from a non-physical trauma, but it actually is a physical injury. And we have science that's emerging that's beginning to give us a picture. The cannabinoid deficit that's being established, a correlation with these internal endogenous cannabinoids that we have in our body. Cannabis-like substance that's, I guess, energized when you smoke a joint. That's what happens inside your body is as a result of an internal chemical, a cannabinoid, and those endocannabinoids are evidently in short supply with someone that's suffering from post-traumatic stress. That's very interesting. But at any rate, the drugs that they're giving for these medications for pain, for example, there's like 20 or 30 medications. A lot of them suck, and some of them cause overdose. But there's like 30 choices. With post-traumatic stress, there's just 2 drugs, and of those 2 drugs, they both have, and the FDA-approved drugs, 2 of them, and they both have a suicide warning, a black box suicide warning on the side of the bottle. So if we can have veterans and other patients using cannabis and actually getting enough benefit where they're not using so many of those pills, I don't think it's rocket science that we could lower the suicide rate. But on top of that, there's some science and some correlation, with the pharmacological effect of cannabis actually lowering suicide rate, and certainly lowering the need for such high levels of opiates and things like that. And that's where the lower opiate overdoses comes in. So it's really fascinating how it all interconnects. But that's what our policy has been, and that's what we've been working on. We're really, like I said, very proud that we're almost at the end of the road of that particular project of adding post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition. And then actually, to finish your question, finish the answer to your question, I just came back from Washington, D.C., where I was with Weed for Warriors. And that's a rabbit hole if you want to get into talking about their protest up there. But they were protesting the treatment of vets and trying to give a voice to vets. But they also went off on some tangents that were really weird. But one of them was to protest Johns Hopkins. And that's, there's some validity to their protest, but also a lot of questions as to, what exactly their end goal is in these types of protests. But the reason why they were protesting Johns Hopkins is because Dr. Sisley's study, as I talked about before, with MAPS, was working with Johns Hopkins, and Johns Hopkins and Dr. Sisley got a grant for like $2 million to do this study. Interestingly, the money's coming from Colorado, from the licenses, the permits, the cards that patients get. They pay a fee, and some of that money is surplus, and they use it for research and stuff. And a couple of $1 million of that money was dedicated to this research, and some of it was actually sent to Johns Hopkins. They were a partner, and they dropped out of the study. And they dropped out right after Rick Doblin with MAPS and Dr. Sue Sisley were quoted in the press complaining about the quality of the medicine that was coming from the United States federal government, NIDA. So everyone, is basically connected that, Johns Hopkins must have dropped out of the study because they're friends with NIDA, and, they don't want to be around while NIDA is being complained about. But actually, John Hopkins has offered up a varying explanation where they said they didn't like the protocol that they were working on with Dr. Sisley, and they worked and worked for like a year to try to fix that protocol, and they never really could work well with Dr. Sisley and Rick Doblin, and they dropped out. So, from my perspective, John Hopkins, like all the universities with their relationship with the U.S. federal government, really should take a hard look at whether they're actually serving the public interest and whether they should look more into medical marijuana. I agree with that, but I don't hold John Hopkins responsible really in this particular thing. It seems like they both have a perspective. I'm not going to take one side or the other. I think it's really bad and it's sad, but in the end, the study will eventually get done, I think, and hopefully Dr. Sisley can finish the study in Arizona all by herself without John Hopkins in Maryland. And as I said before, we're operating from a mountain of research from Israel, from Canada, from Great Britain, from the United States. But double-blind, placebo-based studies on other things, chronic, nerve pain, etc. Safety studies. We cobble all these things together, and we come up with a picture telling us what we need to know. And evidently, NIDA doesn't have that capability. They can't look at a study of THC and somehow extrapolate that might extend some value to the plant material that contains THC. It's an absurdity to me. It's like saying that vitamin C is good, but an orange, no, you don't want that.
Well, it sounds like you've been very busy. Um, for those of the viewers that don't know, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Michael, can you tell us what are some common symptoms and what is your take on using medical marijuana to treat these symptoms?
Well, post-traumatic stress is pretty rough. It's interesting that, and I think that's one of the things about it, that it doesn't affect everyone. So let's say there's 10 people in a truck that gets blown up by like a roadside bomb, and few of them get mortally injured, and the rest survive. And out of them, a couple of them might have no post-traumatic stress symptoms at all, or you don't know who's going to have post-traumatic stress symptoms and who's not. It's just totally, a bunch of people come out of a combat zone, and you really, I don't think there's any way to look at them or look at who they are, or look at anything about them, their emotional stability, or that's why I think it's not this psychological kind of thing. That there's nothing to unless they come up with some sort of cannabinoid-based test in the future or something. But I think that it really does make sense. If you look at the human condition, and if you look at this, medical condition, you think about like humans maybe 10,000 years ago or something like that, where they were living in a valley, and at one end of the valley they were attacked by like a saber-toothed tiger. Those who survived that attack, some of them would have post-traumatic stress. And what's post-traumatic stress going to do? It's going to put you on hyper alert, hyper vigilance, they call it. You're not going to be able to sleep. You're going to be up at all hours of the night and day looking for that saber-toothed tiger. And it's not crazy behavior. It's actually, in a way, almost a defense mechanism of the whole. If you look at it, like, society is benefiting from those few people being on hyper alert because there was a threat. It's a real threat. It's not something they imagined. It's something they experienced. And I think nature knows these things happen in multiples, and if you look at it that way, I think it really does help you understand that this is something that the person suffering from it is suffering from something very real, and it really interrupts sleep. I get the reports back from vets that they can hardly sleep. They close their eyes, and they're right back wherever they were in their trauma. And I think that it's also, like Dr. Sisley was saying, it's also connected to a lot of things. It's, as she would say, it's part of a constellation of symptoms. So picture that truck again. Those who survive the truck are all going to have pain issues. I don't think there are going to be all that many post-traumatic stress sufferers in a combat situation that aren't going to have a pain issue. So all these things are sort of work together, and also are the reason why veterans come out of the VA hospital with this big bag full of pills, like literally 10 jars of pills, and they're told to go home and feel better. And it just doesn't work. We know the vets tell me very consistently, I'm a zombie if I take all these pills that they're giving me. I just don't. It doesn't make me feel better at all. I don't feel anything. I can't, you know, play with my kids. I don't really have any life at home with my wife anymore. My husband or whatever. And on that note too, I think it's worth mentioning that just about all the vets that I've worked with have been, very quick to point out to me, that they are doing whatever they're doing to advocate for this for all patients. We as vets have the ability to, make this a veterans issue and make people listen to us, maybe in certain audiences because we're a veteran, and we take advantage of that. But I think we're all conscious that this is a, much bigger issue, and that we're just patients, that suffer from it like any other patient. And there's a lot of people that have been carrying around post-traumatic stress symptoms their whole life, from childhood trauma, or first responders and ambulance squads and police, and a lot of different walks of life that are likely to have high numbers of post-traumatic stress, and they definitely can benefit from cannabis and will in the future. Hopefully, shedding some of the stereotypes and shedding some of the negative connotation of maybe that they are being weak or something by seeking treatment. All these, and again, that was part of what we were hoping to do with cannabis, is by having people embrace cannabis as a treatment to really empower themselves, and to show that this is a treatment, and you don't have to be embarrassed, that you're suffering from a medical condition and you're treating
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
Absolutely. You mentioned when these veterans would take all these pills and they'd feel like they're zombies. What is your experience with veterans who use medical marijuana instead of the pills?
Well, it's no panacea, that's for sure, and it's tricky. The vets that I work with, that really have great success, you can upset that real easy. It often comes down to certain combinations of certain strains and certain, methods of administration and stuff like that that they get to, kind of a groove, and that can be upset pretty easily. But I've heard back from vets that they've really been able to rebuild, part of their life. Kind of this thing that Nurse Heather from the Cannabis Nurses Association calls the post-traumatic growth instead of post-traumatic stress. She calls it post-traumatic growth, and growing as an individual through understanding your condition and understanding the treatment. And I really appreciate that, and I think that that's kind of where we're at. It's a learning experience for everybody, and I often um, feel that the feedback that I get from people around the veteran is the the biggest indicator for me. Family, friends, neighbors, whatever. You know, if they're telling me that this person really seems to be benefiting from that, that seems to be a pretty objective viewpoint. And uh, our take is that we protect the doctor-patient relationship. We're about making sure that the doctor and the patient can come about a treatment plan and act on the treatment plan without interference from the cops or whoever. And I don't. That's not only is it not an unreasonable ask, but it's requirement of all our basic standards of our of society that's bought into basic human rights and things like that, which is certainly Canada and the United States. And I think that uh, you know you really have to look at things in the big picture. That I think the best scenario for us would be for the vet to be able to use cannabis and then reintegrate that into the VA system. In other words, have access to all the other treatments that might be available through the VA. They're doing some good stuff. They have meditation, they got service dogs, they got field trips, they got occupational therapy, they got counseling, they got a lot of stuff, and that together with cannabis, that's what cannabis isn't a way out for us, it's more a way in, and it's a way to get past some of the pitfalls, these big bags full of pills that are really killing our patients.
Absolutely. It's it's definitely a good thing to move towards. You mentioned earlier that smoking a joint would be during that test they did, the best way to get.
Yes, I talked about the vaporizer. It's interesting. 1999, the Institute of Medicine, National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine, did this big review, and they didn't consider vaporizers, and vaporizers were coming up at that time. It's interesting. I was talking to you guys earlier. That there's a history that crosses over with my world. I was doing these informational tables, and some of the activism that I was doing brought me to Holland, to the Netherlands, and I actually met up with an activist over there, a guy named Eagle Bill. Eagle Bill was a vet. He passed away a couple years back, and we really miss him. But he was a great activist, and what he would do, he had this contraption. It was kind of a bong thing that he had set up, and he found some glassware somewhere that, when he put it on there, he was able to fit a hot air gun to it, and he came up with a crude vaporizer. And he would take that out. Like, one of the stories I really remember fondly was, he went out into the countryside there and brought it to this little old lady's, little Dutch lady's house where she was suffering so badly, and gave her a couple of inhalations off of this crude vaporizer and just watched the pain melt away from her face. That vaporizer was the beginning of a lot of our vaporizer technology that we see today. He was ardent in sharing this with everyone, turned hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people onto it at these cannabis cups and stuff in Amsterdam. And the guys that got together with him that wanted to market it, they're the guys that created the volcano. And it was funny too, because they initially went to these the hot air gun people and said, we want to build a vaporizer using this, based on this idea of Eagle Bills. And the hot air gun people were horrified, that people would actually try to use a hot air gun to heat up the plant material like that. So they had to quickly change the technology to where it wasn't blowing air past magnets or whatever else was going on in a hot air gun. And that's where the volcano came in. And interestingly, I just wanted to mention, I was thinking about this earlier, but I think it's so funny. I said something about my background in antiques and all that. When I was a little kid, there was this thing that you could collect. I collected little miniature things, and there was this little miniature medical device. It was essentially a medical device, but it was an oil lamp that was in this little stand and had a little tray on top, and you put medicine in the little tray, and it vaporized it. And the product was called the vapocresylene lamp, and it was vapocresylene liquid that you put in the little tray. And the lamp in the little stand was just so cool, and it was a really interesting thing that I owned one when I was a child. And this is like going well over 100 years ago. This vaporization idea was well integrated into care. We've kind of lost it, I think, over time. We don't vaporize as much, but cannabis has basically helped in the rebirth, I think, of vaporization. And I think, I don't know, from my perspective, it seems that one of the byproducts of that has been, people that smoke cigarettes have really enjoyed the vaporizers to help them vaporize THC, the nicotine, rather than smoking it as a smoking cessation. But the thing about that is that that's still nicotine. I think people need to realize that nicotine, the active ingredient in tobacco, is sold at the farm supply as a pesticide. If you look it up in the dictionary, the nicotine says sticky brown alkaloid commonly used as pesticide. But whereas THC is actually the active ingredient in cannabis, it won't work very good as a pesticide. Bugs aren't really annoyed by it at all. And it is listed by the FDA as a medicine, and it is the medicinal aspect, according to the FDA, of cannabis that has been so safe that they actually down-regulated it since they made it a medicine. So it's just fascinating, that this stuff doesn't line up with the government's line, the government's spin.
It's amazing how you're telling this story about how the first vaporizer was invented, and now there's dozens of different brands that you can take a look at Namaste Technologies, namastevapes.com. You can see all different brands. Um, do you have anything else you want to add before we say goodnight?
Yeah, you want to take a break? I'm sure we'll come back and talk more in the future. I have a feeling that as you're working on this project, we're going to want to talk again. And I really appreciate you taking this on, and I appreciate Namaste for taking this on and working with vets. We're kind of just embarking on I think a relationship that will yield some really great projects and some great coordination and collaboration between the industry. Namaste is in the industry, and our veterans working in the not-for-profit sector. We have a lot that we can gain from each other, and I think we're going to be learning and growing together as we kind of try to figure out and understand what's going on out there. It's going back and forth. The technology is growing, and then people are kind of voting with their feet and forcing the technology to move with them. So I'm not sure where anything's going. It seems to be very different kind of realities for the patient, like in Canada, using the whole flowers that they get from the program up there, and the patients in the USA, many of them using oils and extracts. So yeah, the vaporizers, as we're going to be embarking on this exploration of this new technology, I think we're all in it together. So I really appreciate that.
And we really appreciate all the work you're doing for our veterans and the work we're going to do together. We at Namaste Technologies are dedicated to helping our veterans. We're offering a discount on our products, and we will be donating a portion of our proceeds to veterans charities. Michael Krawitz, thank you so much. Can't wait to talk to you again, and hope you have a great night.
Thank you so much, and good luck with this series.
Thank you so much. Take care.